This will be part one of my talk about drugs and alcohol in adolescence with an emphasis on Israel. So, what makes drugs attractive for adolescents? First of all, we spoke a lot in this class about the persistent fluctuations in adolescents' mood, all these feelings, very intense feelings that they have of sadness, worry, helplessness. This roller coaster that they're on makes drugs an attractive escape. Sometimes there are feelings of hopelessness and pessimism, guilt, devaluation, inability to help oneself. So, sort of, drugs can be a way to self-medicate. Eating disorders can also cause you to want to try drugs. Maybe that will help you lose weight. Also, sleep problems, another way of self-medicating. The whole irritability that has to do with adolescents make drugs attractive for them. The fact that they have difficulties all the time concentrating and decision making, and even depression and recurrent thoughts of death and suicide. All these factors can make adolescents be attracted to drugs. The Youth at Risk Association in Israel publishes a yearly report, and they talk about more than 500,000 of youth being at some sort of risk having to do with the difficulties of adolescence, exaggerated by the stress of life in Israel, and then 120,000 youth who have difficulty dealing with adolescence, and they have suicidal thoughts, and they handle depression, drug and alcohol abuse, and they don't get enough response from their families. So they're talking about 120,000 youth in Israel. That's a lot. And they continue that continuum with 80,000 who have inability to function in school, sense of failure, dropout, educational gaps, drugs and alcohol abuse, and severe emotional and family problems. 30,000 youth completely exited the normative frameworks, don't integrate, are involved in negative sources of pleasures, drugs and alcohol abuse, delinquency and crime. And finally, 8,000 who are at fatal risk, who are homeless, delinquent, prostitutes, drug addiction, detachment from family, and so on. So 8,000, all in all, quite a few adolescents at risk. So part of the attraction for youth is this whole transition from childhood to adulthood. So adolescents, as I have reminded you frequently throughout this class, are at a midpoint between being children and being adults. And so they want to be adults. They want to be like the adults. And if being an adult includes behavior like smoking and alcohol and drugs, then they want to be adults. They want to be part of it. Blending with peers is a very important pressure. I've had quite a few youth come to my clinic who say, everyone around us are smoking weed, and it's very hard not to. It's very hard to come to a party and not smoke because you're looked at, you're frowned at. And of course, the sensation seeking, everything is so intense in adolescence, and adolescents, they seek these sensations. They want to feel new things, and so adolescence really exacerbates this sensation seeking behaviors and makes them seek alcohol. And for adolescents, it's all about the peer group. They want to be separated from their parents. They want to be different, even if the parents are so supportive and positive and they act in the most ideal way. Still, these adolescents may have adjustment difficulties, and trying to fit in may well be drawn into drugs and alcohol. And of course, when we're talking about families, when there are problems and where the family is not functioning very well, then they are very dependent on peers, and then going into drugs and alcohol may offer uh, peer acceptance on the one hand, and also, an escape from their usual world. And and the educational institutions, sadly, are not very open and not very understanding. A lot of the times, the adolescents feel that they're obtuse, they're not understanding them, and so again, drugs and alcohol may be a very, very good way to escape. An important concept to understand in this regard is the idea of risk factors, all sorts of characteristics of adolescents that put them at risk for drugs and alcohol. So we can see all sorts of community risk factors like the availability of drugs. We can see all sorts of family risk factors like family history. We can see school risk factors like, for example, academic failure. And we can see individual risk factors like, for example, alienation and rebelliousness. You can look at that further. And the temperament can be a protective factor. All sorts of competencies and skills, and having a mentor, for example, can be a protective factor. When you have this one teacher, for example, that you really bonded with, and you feel, this is a person I would do stuff for. When this teacher tells me something, I am willing to listen. I'm willing to do stuff, then that's another protective factor. So when we look at this graph, for example, we can see how it grows exponentially. So when you have one risk factor, then it's only the risk is very low, and then as you see the risk factors accumulate, then it really spikes and gets to really high percentage. So once you have, for example, 9 to 10 risk factors, then you have an 80% plus chance of getting into trouble. For example, drugs and alcohol. This graph shows this trend even better, as you can see how slowly it sort of goes up. 0 to 1, 2 to 3 is really, really low for students 6 to 12 grade. But then as the risk factors accumulate, you see more and more. And again, you can see on the right here the influence of protective factors. Once you have those, the situation is better. And specifically, you can see in this slide, in this figure, you can see the effect on drugs, and you can see that the curve is slowly rising. Once you hit 8 risk factors, then we're talking about a very steep increase in the percentage of youth taking drugs in the last 30 days. And in this figure, you can see it relating to violence. So how exposed are you to violence? Once again, you see a steep increase in the percentage of people suffering from violence once you hit a certain risk level, a certain number of risk factors. And we can see this for a number of at-risk behaviors. So this is very obvious when we look at the early sexual activity. It increases dramatically with the number of risk factors. We can see homelessness rising with the number of factors, deliberate self-harm, as well as depression. So one question that needs to be asked is, are drugs a problem? Because it's part of human culture. We've had documented drug use in human culture for 5,000 years. Adults use it all the time. It's very common. It's not something that's only done by shady figures and delinquents and so on. And you see it in the movies all the time. So is it a problem? It is. It is. That's the point here, especially for adolescents. And the earlier you use drugs, the more you are at risk for one of the major problems, which is addiction, which causes death and loss of productivity and a cost for society and a cost for families. In Israel, we can see that the drugs and alcohol especially afflict youth from the former Soviet Union, from Ethiopia, from the Arab sector, and a lot of dropouts, a lot of people who will basically not be able to fulfill themselves in life because of this early crisis that they experience with drugs and alcohol. And there's also a more mild, but still very significant problem that has to do with drugs, with the fact that you're sort of losing touch with reality. You're not uh, you're not fulfilling your potential as a person because you're always escaping into the drugs and so on. So many consequences to drug use. If we look at this is a 2011 survey in Israel, we can see that among high school students, about 6% use cannabis, and then you can see a whole lot of other drugs that people are that students are using. So this is quite common, and of course, alcohol is as well. The good news, well, let's not start with the good news. The bad news is, again, that it affects more the minorities and the disadvantaged groups. Actually, in sociology, minority is any group that is disadvantaged. That's the definition of a minority. And disadvantaged groups are suffering more. We can see that with the coronavirus now. This has been very prominent on the news, talking about the Black community in the United States suffering more from corona. They're suffering more from drugs and alcohol as well in the United States. And in Israel, we can see that while we see the percentages for native Israelis, we can see that, for example, for people who have immigrated into Israel, the percentages are much higher. And I also spoke about Arabs, who are a native minority. The good news are that we're still way below other countries. So when I'm talking about 5, 6% in Israel, we're talking about 41% in England and 35% in the United States. And when we're talking about harder drugs as well, Israel is still not there among the other nations, the OECD, Western countries. We're still not at that level. So let's talk a bit about what drugs are and how they work. So drugs work in the central nervous system. So the brain is part of the central nervous system. There's the peripheral nervous system as well. So that all the wires that sort of transmit pain and other sensory information from the body to the brain, and then transmit all the motor commands from the brain to the body. And we have, so all of that is called the central nervous system, and that's where the drugs work. And these are also called psychoactive substances, and they affect mostly neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters are something that happens naturally in the brain, and they are modulated by drugs, and their release is sort of moderated or changed, or they're just produces much more, or any number of mechanisms to have the neurotransmitters stay more in the brain and have more of an effect. That's the way that drugs work. The brain has a way to defend itself from all sorts of ingredients. So things that you eat will not usually go into your brain because of something called the blood-brain barrier. So the blood-brain barrier sort of prevents substances from entering your brain and having an effect there. And basically, drugs, psychoactive substances are the sort of materials that are able to penetrate the blood-brain barrier. And there are all sorts of ways to sort of reach the brain, and there are all sorts of ways to take drugs. So you can do that by digestion, you can do that by injecting, You can do that by snorting drugs, so all sorts of ways to get the drugs to your brain. So there is a drug reaction interaction. So the relative strength of the drug's effect is it changes according to the amount of drug and the person's reactivity, weight, and so on. So as the amount of drugs increases, then the effect increases to a certain extent, and then we have something called tolerance. Tolerance means that with time, you will need more and more quantities to get the same effect, and people will need more and more drugs to feel the way that they felt the first time that they took. So when we talk about dependence, when we talk about addiction, we're talking about several phenomena that happen. One is tolerance that I've just mentioned, the fact that you need more and more of the drug to get the same effect. We're talking about withdrawal, or in Hebrew they call it kriz. Basically, what happens when you start not taking the drug, when you go cold turkey, then you get all sorts of responses, physical responses, mental responses that affect you. So withdrawal is also a part of dependence and addiction. What happens in addiction that you take more and more quantities, more than you've intended, you try to reduce it, you think that you have control of it, but you can't. You invest a lot of time and effort, and it also can very, very much damage your functioning, either financially, academically, within the family, socially, and so on. And so this is what we're talking about when we're talking about addiction. And the damages that can be caused by drugs are ample. There are many, many different damages. And of course, this is a list of all the damages that can happen with all drugs. So it's quite substantial. So perception, alert, and psychomotor behavior is very famous. You know, don't drink and drive, and so on. Don't smoke and drive. Disturbance in attention, thinking, judgment, and interpersonal behavior, very, very relevant to schools. And with with harder drugs, then we're talking about hallucinations, we're talking about memory problems, psychosis, mood disorders, depression, panic attacks, anxiety, suicide attempts, sleep disturbances, and sexual dysfunction.